Rebecca, thank you so much for coming back to the Mindful Parenting Podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm so glad you asked. It's a pleasure.
I feel like, we have to talk about toddlers every once in a while because they're so mind-boggling and like that, like so much stuff comes to a head at the toddler period. And I was just letting you know, like my neighbor next door has now moved from being a baby to being a little toddler. She toddles around like we have our like dog parties in the cul-de-sac, and she toddles around the dog parties, and she's like so cute. I haven't seen a single tantrum from her, but of course I'm just the neighbor, so I'm sure
Mm,
there's. And I gave mom and dad your book to look at. I said,
thank you.
you will want this. And apparently I asked about it, and she said, apparently they're reading it together at like lunchtime or something, and she calls it studying together.
Oh my gosh, that's so cute. I was gonna say, like, if they have a 1.5-year-old and they're managing to have lunch together, part of me feels like the last thing they should be doing is reading my book. Like, but if that's how they want to spend their time, that's great. Right, exactly.
Okay, so we're going to get into talking about the big emotions and things like that and how to handle those things. But what I always think it's interesting to refresh ourselves on, like, what is it about you that made you fascinated with these small, chaotic little human beings?
It's such a good question. I mean, I've always been drawn to kids with big feelings. And I think in some ways, toddlers have the biggest feelings of all, just completely unfiltered, unspoiled by the world. They're like walking ids, if we want to go back to Freud. I mean, and I think they're really often misunderstood and thought of as kind of other than human in some way. And I was drawn to that and drawn to understanding them and helping others, more importantly, kind of understand them and see them for who
Yeah,
they are, which is little people.
I know. I think a lot of us think of them as other, as like very, very different because they're just, yeah, they're so, I guess, like in our culture, right? Like we value, yeah, I don't know, we value when you got it together.
Right,
And
exactly.
they're so completely don't have it together in a big
They're
way.
so out there and they're not old enough yet to try to hide that or, appear otherwise. And I think there's something so endearing about that. But I think probably the most powerful interventions that I do with clients, with families I work with, is say, how would it feel if it's golden rule style. It's like, well, what would it be like if you heard that? Or what do and it's like their eyes, open wider and they're like, I never thought of it that way. It's like they're little people. Like they're going to experience you as a person.
Yeah,
And that
I
reminder is always good.
no, I think that's such a great place to start because yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like one of the things that, you know, I talk about a lot when we're talking about communication is like if you're a toddler, you're you're being ordered about all day long. Like, put on your shoes, come over here, go over there, take off your shoes, get in the chair, get out of the chair, come in the car, get
Yeah.
out of the car. It's just like again and again orders and commands all day long. And I don't think anyone of any age really likes to be ordered and commanded. So it gets a resentment kind of built into that. And sometimes a lot of times parents, we don't even see it like really, oh yeah, I am doing that all day wrong, and it's hard to even hear that we're doing that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been using an analogy recently, which I haven't used in the past, but it's been pretty powerful of if our toddler or young kid is kind of doing something and we want them to stop or we want them, as you said, to come here for a second, we just demand that. All of a sudden, it's just like, Kate, come here. Kate, I said, come here. And it's like the idea that we would ever, let's say, speak with a coworker that way, right? It's
Hmm.
like without like taking a moment and looking at what they're doing and saying, like, okay, hey, Kate, I need to speak with you. Can you, I mean, this is speaking to an adult, obviously, but like, you want to wrap up what you're doing and find some time, with the toddler, we can say, when you're done with your puzzle, or oh my gosh, that milk looks delicious. Then we're gonna go do this, just something that cushions it a little bit. And I think you're right. We get into and we just bark orders in a way that we would never speak with other people, which doesn't mean, just to potentially anticipate a listener question, it doesn't mean that we don't have the power and the responsibility of telling them kind of what they need to do and setting structure and setting limits. But there's a way to do that that's not just like do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that.
Yeah, when I think about what you said, like put myself in their shoes and the golden rule, like if somebody, I would feel disrespected if somebody spoke to me like that is disrespectful to just say, come over here, drop everything you're doing and come over here. It's not respecting my life or, what I'm doing or anything like that, my autonomy, my time, any of that. And it's interesting because one of the big things that we want as parents is we want respect, right? We want to, demand respect and things like that. And we think that we kind of equate in a lot of sense that obedience with respect, but we're not modeling it, are we, in the situation, right? Because they're going to communicate with us a lot of ways the way we communicate what we're modeling, but we're not modeling being respectful of their time or anything like that in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And I think I would feel disrespected, like you said, and I think also I'd feel confused. It's like, wait, why are you annoyed? Like I'm just registering what you said and sitting here just taking a moment to finish my breath. Like why are you angry with me? I haven't, it's almost like disorienting in some ways. And I think we want so much for our kids to develop a strong sense of self and confidence. And I hear that from parents all the time, and self-assuredness. And yet interacting in that way is going to take all that away in some ways.
Yeah, it's funny. I got to call myself out here too, because like my 14-year-old, like sometimes if I'm stressed and I've had a bit day and, I'm just not in a good place and I'll come inside, I'll see like a wrapper, I'll see the dishes aren't done, I'll see her backpacks, I'll see a million things and it'll just be like the straw that, like, and I'll come and I'll be like, Sora, can't you blah 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 blah, and she'll be like, why are you mad at me? Like, what did I do? And I'm like, oh, I now I hear what I sound like, and I'm like, no, I'm not mad at you. I'm just like, I have to own up.
Right, right.
I've had a stressful morning, and this is just, I'm sorry, but yes, all this stuff really does make me feel a little frustrated.
Yeah, no, and I have that too. I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I'll say, like, if I notice a wrapper, let's say, it's like, Henry, come pick this up. Because to me, it's like he knows not to leave wrappers on the floor, and there's a wrapper on the floor. But it just goes so much better if I look up and I see what he's doing.
Mm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, bud, when you're done with that chapter, or like when you get a second. Or an even better one, and I find this works with little kids too, although not quite toddler age. What's your plan? Right? I noticed there's a wrapper on the floor. What's your plan? And inevitably, they'll say, I'm going to pick it up when I'm done with this chapter. Or, oh, I didn't, like, it just is going to go so much better than me being like, hey, now, I see there's a wrapper. Get up. Get up and pick it up. Even if that's where my mind is.
Yeah, yeah, we're like burning our good credit at that point, right? Like we're
Right.
burning it off for something that's so minor.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So one of the things you talk about is you give a talk called Love and Limits, right? So we have these little creatures. We have to hold limits for them. Okay, we don't, the listeners here saying, "Oh God, okay, all right, I don't want to be barking orders." But then how do I hold some limits with this toddler who is just prone to be like exploding like a time bomb at any moment?
Yeah. This is why your neighbors are studying, Although I actually think when I give this talk, I think a lot about, or I talk a lot about how there's so much noise out there with parenting right now. And there's so many like little things to remember and this script and that script. And is my child this kind of child or that kind of, and it's love and limits. I just feel like is actually a simplification. It's just, when there's something going on at home or a behavior you don't like or something that doesn't feel good, if we go back to those foundational pillars of love and limits, we can usually figure out a good path forward. And one more kind of just piece of background information about it before I answer your question is just this idea that for too long they were seen as, or have been seen as, the opposite ends of a continuum. You have love on one side and limits on the other. And that's actually not true, right? It's an x-axis and a y-axis. It's been shown, as I don't have to tell you, but perhaps for the listeners, decades of very elegant research that when you are in that top right quadrant with high love and high limits, that's where kids thrive.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you set limits with really little ones? Back to your question. I was hoping to deflect it. Exactly. So I think of limits as and this isn't just me, this is something I read at some point, but it really resonated, is, limits are like a fence around our child, meaning that they're allowed to play and explore and be free within that fence. And the fence gets wider and wider, that circle, as they get older and older. And it is their job to push up against the fence. And it is our job to make sure that that fence doesn't fall down. And maybe it can bend a little bit, depending. But for the most part, that fence needs to be a sturdy fence. And so limits are a container. They're containing your child. They're allowing your child to feel safe and free and exploratory within this set parameter. And the way to do that, particularly with toddlers, has less to do with what you do when they're doing a behavior that you don't want them to do, although we can certainly talk about that, and more to do with setting structures and routines that keep things running smoothly and that keep their world predictable, because the whole world is so unpredictable for them. They're so new to everything, and that includes feelings. Like, they're new to feeling frustrated. Can you imagine? I mean, we can't really, but like the first time you ever had the feeling of like really, really wanting something and seeing it and not being able to have it. Like, what an awful, awful feeling if you think about not having any context for that.
Mm-hmm. It's hard.
And so, yeah, it's like wait, but it's there. Like, what, and so having meals be at predictable times, having meals go in predictable ways from your perspective, right? You cannot have a 2-year-old eat in a predictable way per se, but the meal routine or the bedtime routine or bedtime or what mom is like at a given time or what dad says at a given time, not in any kind of like military school style, but just a level of consistency where kids feel contained and they feel safe. And that's typically what I mean by limits. And that can be, putting something into a schedule that wasn't in a schedule. Like, I've recently worked with a few families actually where mom and dad, heteronormative family, mom and dad trade off on bedtimes. And it's still sort of really chaotic. And every time mom comes in, they want dad. And when dad comes in, they want mom. And it's just, and I've said, just make a schedule where you have mom's picture. It's so easy now to print out pictures, not like on photo paper, but just like on a regular printer, print out a picture of mom and a picture of dad and have it be every other, for a week. And starting in the morning, it's like, oh, let's look who's putting you to bed tonight. Oh, whose face is that? Mom, and parents will say to me, oh, they know who's putting them to bed. Like, and I'm like, I don't know that they hold that in mind. Like, their brains are rapidly developing. And even if they know on some level, the idea that they can see it, the idea that you go over it with them, the idea that it becomes routinized does so much to calm toddlers and to help toddlers feel like there's a system, there's a plan in place. And when there's a system and a plan in place, there's that fence. And I feel contained. And when I feel contained, I feel regulated. And when I feel regulated, I'm not that ticking time bomb, as you said.
Oh, yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, the idea of like, yeah, we do it every other night, so it's a routine, yet I love this idea of like, let's just go over it because they're so in the moment. I mean, that's the beautiful thing we can learn from them is like how to be so in the moment, how to be so kind of swept up in awe in the moment. And that's wonderful. I almost think of it as like, it almost must be like if you were, I don't know, if you were on drugs or like you were drunk or something, you know what I mean? Like you're so in the moment, you're just swept up with something. You're not completely 100% of your brain is not like it. If you were dancing or something, you're not thinking about anything else, and then all of a sudden something else comes along. I can almost picture that as a similar state of mind, but like, and then but then to say, okay, later, the picture, the visual, because we're such visual people, and to say, okay, and this is what's happening later, to just plant that seed. Yeah, I remember we did. I want to give Kim Payne from Simplicity Parenting credit for this. We did like a meal rhythm for our weeks. And it was like one of the best things we did, where we had a schedule where like Monday was, I forget what Monday was like rice night. Tuesday was something. Wednesday was pasta. Friday was pizza. We tacos in there. I don't know. I forget what we had, but it was just like we had this rhythm. And that made our kids like, they would just be like, "Oh, what's tonight? Oh, okay, it's not." And then, and then they'd be like, "Okay, well, I can hang out for pasta because I only have one more night to go for pasta night." But it just gave them this sense of like, "Oh, okay, I know what's coming up. Yeah, I feel safe." That whole thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
And so, yeah, no, you go ahead.
oh no, I just want to underscore what you said, because limits have less to do with what to do when they're doing a behavior and more about routines and structures. This is such an answer that like we don't want to hear, because this is like the infrastructure answer.
Right, exactly. It's like, oh, but that sounds like so much work. And it's like, yeah. And it's so much, it's a lot of work on the front end, but you end up saving so much energy because you're not angry all the time. And you're not frustrated all the time, and you're not waiting for that next explosion. And the explosions are going to happen, right? I mean, that's sort of needs to be said at the outset. Toddlers have tantrums, period, and they're supposed to have tantrums. The idea is that we can make them less frequent, last shorter, be less intense, right? It's about intensity, duration, and frequency. And then the other way to set limits with toddlers a lot of the time is physical limits, right? So I will never forget, I used to do a lot of home observations. And when I first started doing home observations, I kept seeing kind of the same thing again and again. One was a family that said that their child kept touching all these like expensive glass vases. And so it was sort of like, I can't believe I have my doctorate and I get to tell you, like, move the vases. I remember a week later, it was like a toddler who kept throwing a ball at the ceiling and almost hitting the light, and the parent saying over and over again, "Stop, stop, stop, stop." And it's just like, take the ball, right? I mean, again, and it doesn't have to be punitive. It's not this idea of, if you can't stop throwing that ball, then I'm going to take it. It's, you're clearly too little to be holding this ball. It's too hard to hold this ball and not throw it at the ceiling. So I'm going to take it from you. And your child might get really upset. Similarly, not to tell your child 75 times not to climb up on the bookshelf. Pick your child up and go to a different room, right? And not to wait so long to do that. I've seen so many power struggles and kind of parents feeling helpless when they are asking kids to do something that is above that child's developmental capacity. So one of the things that's really not developed yet in toddlers is impulse control, which lives in the prefrontal cortex, part of the executive functioning system. And there was a big study done years ago showing that there's, I think, over 50% of parents in all different cross sections of the United States overestimate their 2 and 3-year-olds specifically when it comes to impulse control, and particularly impulse control around aggression. And I used to give talks. Now I give mostly virtual talks, but I still give some in-person talks. And at one point, when somebody would raise their hand to ask a question, I would say, "Can you please restate the question in Japanese?" Taking a risk that the parent did not know Japanese. And it never happened that the person did. And they would sort of look at me, and they'd start speaking again in English. And I'd say, "No, I'm sorry, maybe you didn't understand me. Please say the question in Japanese." Sort of uncomfortable laughter, some shuffling. They'd try again. I'd say it again. And then I would, before it got too tense, I would cut it off and I would say, "What does it feel like when I'm asking you to do something that is completely out of your abilities? It is so confusing. It is so disorienting. And my guess is if I had let it go, you would have gotten very angry at me and stormed away. That's what happens when we keep telling a toddler, don't climb on the bookshelf or don't hit your sister over and over and over again. And we're not creating some sort of physical boundary. It's like, and then we get angry. It's like, they're telling, I can't. I know my language is developed. My understanding is developed. I know I'm not supposed to hit the baby. I can't not hit the baby. It is too tempting. I do not have impulse control. I just want to know what it feels like. They're basically begging you, can you please just hold the baby away from me right now? And instead we keep saying, I said, don't hit the baby, don't hit the baby, don't hit the baby, don't hit the baby. And we get more frustrated and we end up in this really difficult interpersonal thing with a 2-year-old.
Yeah, I think this is such an important thing to underscore, the overestimation of impulse control and control in general. I definitely overestimated my child's impulse control because she was so verbal, and she just seemed so much older when she was 2. And someone on the podcast told, a neuroscientist said to think of toddlers and, especially toddlers as babies who can. And I thought if I had only thought of my child as a baby who could walk, I would have saved myself so much heartache because I just had such high expectations of them to be able to do what she couldn't do.
Well, I think we expect without even realizing it that all of their abilities kind of develop at the same rate and the same level. We know it for physical. We know that they can't necessarily, as we said before, really walk, and that they certainly can't, let's say, hop on one foot, and yet they can still toddle around. We're not as good as, with the invisible things, all the cognitive abilities, at recognizing how differentially they develop, and that your language develops way before your impulse control. So I can tell you as a 2.5 or 3-year-old exactly what I'm not supposed to do, and then go do it. And that's not because I'm, being defiant and I'm out to get you, although possibly, and that's part of the assessment I do, right? You certainly also have the testing the limits thing. But it's also, I can tell you that I understand it and still not be able to inhibit the impulses, because that's just a different set of skills that are not developed yet.
It helps so much to understand that these pieces of development, and just to, to get ourselves out of anger and into understanding. So let's talk about how do parents, okay, so let's imagine we're creating a structure. I was thinking even about the physical limits, like toys, right? Like one of the things we talk about in mindful parenting is like reducing the number of toys that are out and then making it easy for your kid to be able to put stuff away. Like, we had, I don't know, like little hooks that they could put their jackets on, and things like that, kind of making that, in Montessori, they call that the prepared environment, so, but that really is about making an environment that is like, there are things accessible that they can interact with, and the things they can't interact with should, as not be accessible. So I think that is so, so helpful, this idea of routine, of structure. I mean, maybe we should stay on that for a second, because I imagine you got a few other tips up your sleeve for parents who are like, well, how do I create routine and structure? What would be beneficial for my kid as far as like the home environment? And also like thinking about the daily routine. Like if you're say a stay-at-home parent with a toddler, what you obviously you want some structure for your daily routine, but like, how busy should toddlers be? Like sometimes in the name of making structure and routine, like you might have like a back-to-back schedule for a toddler. Anyway, can you speak to some of those points?
Yeah, no, and that's such a good point, because those things are not synonymous, right? Having structure and routine does not mean having 10 scheduled periods in your day as a toddler. And I talked about this a lot during COVID, because I said that, your routine, your daily schedule might be you watch Frozen 4 times because you have to work and whatever, but you can still kind of put that in a schedule, 4 pictures of Frozen in a row. And obviously that's hyperbolic, but the point is there's predictability. It doesn't have to do with how many things there are. And it doesn't have to do with, again, toddlers have a hard time with transitions, so you don't need to have 8 transitions. But it's predicting, okay, we're going to have breakfast, and then after breakfast, we get dressed. Then we're going to go outside. We're going to play. And maybe play is open, right? You don't have to structure the play. We're going to go to the playground or whatever it is. Then we're going to come home. We're going to have lunch. Like, that's a pretty mellow schedule, but I was able to break it into 5 different parts and to say it in this very clear and linear way. Toddlers can't yet create a narrative. They can't create a story. That's why it's so incredibly helpful, when a kid trips and falls, to tell them what happened. So we all say, you're okay, you're okay, you're okay. And what we mean is you're not gushing blood and I don't have to take you to the ER. And even saying, even just saying, like, I know you were scared, or you were, and that can be helpful. But I found that the most helpful thing you can do is say, you were running and you didn't see that stick right there, and so you fell and now you're on the ground. And they're like, oh,
Describe.
you put these things in order for me. Like, oh, you helped me understand that one thing led to another. They're figuring out cause and effect, right? If I press this key on the Fisher-Price piano, it turns a yellow light on. Or like they're figuring that out. Same is true. Once we get dressed, we get to go outside. Making these connections for kids. That's what I mean by schedules and routines, not I'm going to sign you up for soccer and then this and then that and then that and then that. And, every minute has to be scheduled. Does that help
Yeah, yeah,
clarify?
yeah. And what would you say? I mean, one of the things that I learned later in life that I wish I had done more of, I did a good amount of, was the idea of like a toddler wants to help so much, thinking about the daily routine, right? And they want to do the things you're doing. And you want to kind of like encourage that, right? You want to say, yes, be a helpful member of the house. Like, don't just sit here on the iPad while I'm doing the work for you. Like, that sends the wrong message. But it's also really hard when toddlers are helping to actually get anything done. I'm just thinking about that. Would it be a good idea for parents to kind of think about a time, like if there's like maybe a pre-dinner prep time, just like double the amount of time it normally takes, and bring your toddler in and just kind of keep that in the schedule, something like that? Would you encourage that sort of thing?
In a perfect world, sure.
Yeah.
I probably myself would have had the bandwidth to do that once a week, if that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Being on your iPad can be part of the schedule, right? And then we're going to come home and I'm going to start making dinner and you're going to be on your iPad because you need a little break and I need a little break. Again, so it's not about, so by all means, if you want to cook with your kid and spend double the time and like really, get a, start chopping tomatoes together and getting messy and whatever, I think that's great. I don't know that many parents that will happily do that every night. And I like to be real. I would certainly say that giving a toddler, a wet dish rag and telling them to wipe the table can buy you 10 minutes. They love wiping the table, especially, not that I encourage this, but if there's like visual, like dust that they're actually cleaning, they can see their progress. And
Oops, I happened to spill this dusting of flour on the table. Sorry.
Exactly. But you can also make up jobs that, like, I used to throw a bunch of, I have one on my, hair elastics in my purse and say I really needed help finding 10 hair elastics. And that was a great job for them while I did whatever I needed to do. It was a job that I fully created, but it was some time away from a screen when I needed to get, so I think there's absolutely ways to capitalize on their wanting to be helpers while also recognizing that unless they're actually engaged in something, it's going to end up being more play and less productive for you.
I really appreciate you bringing us to the realistic middle path for that. That really helps. Okay, so let's think of like when we do have to set a boundary, when we do have to set a limit. What's some of the language that is best to use with a toddler when are like, what is the what to do when a behavior happens?
Short, sweet, short, regulated, clear, calm. What is it? Clear, calm, and what's the third? Connected. Clear, calm. I was like, I came up with this. Why don't I remember it? Clear, calm, and connected. So, oh no, sweetie, I know the bookshelf is really fun and there's no climbing on it. Validating the feeling or the experience, and setting the limit. I know you want another cookie. No more cookies right now.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple. And knowing that they may get upset.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. You know, there's nothing to fear there. So often we end up in these patterns where we're walking on eggshells because we're so worried our child's going to melt down. And we can talk about what happens if that happens in the park or at Target or whatever, but certainly if you're in your own house, like, then they'll melt down. And that's amazing experience for them to get used to the feeling of frustration. That's another skill. You want to talk about impulse control, we can have its best friend, emotion regulation, right next to it. Emotion regulation is not developed when you're a toddler. So what a cool way to practice having the feelings and realizing that they're not going to hurt you, and that mom or dad or caregiver is right there to help you through.
Yeah. Yeah. And dear listener, we've talked a lot about how to help ourselves stay regulated in these really challenging moments in so many episodes of the Mindful Parenting podcast. I invite you to go back to those. We're not going to dive into that today. I want to know, what do you do when you are in Target and the I want it and the meltdown happens, but you really have to get some stuff maybe from Target. What do
you tolerate it, right? You tolerate it. And you know, I would say there's a couple things I think that happen in a public place. One is, and I realized this with my own kids, how quickly we sort of throw our own kids under the bus to commiserate with like some random person we've never seen before in the Target aisle. So our kid is throwing a tantrum and we're like looking at some person we've never met and we're like, oh, I know, parenting, man, like this is so hard. And energetically our kids feel that. It's like, what do you mean this? You don't even know him. Like, I'm struggling. Why are you abandoning me? And I use that word very consciously. I think it's overused. Our kids are not going to be traumatized from that. That is not an actual abandonment, but it is something that can shift a kid to become more dysregulated because we're much more concerned about how we're being perceived than we are with what our kid is going through. And that makes the tantrum worse, right? So there's the tantrum that is happening because, let's say, they can't have the thing at Target. But so much of it then becomes about, are you getting me? Are you understanding me? Are you there for me? And so we can be there for them and just keep, again, calming them down, not in a this is a crisis way, which will upset them more, but in a like, yeah, you're having some feelings and we're at Target. Okay, we're still, I got to get 3 more things and then we're going to be done. And maybe you start singing a song and try to distract and try, but again, ideally, and I highly recommend people go back to your past podcasts, staying regulated because there's not actually a crisis. Your toddler is having a tantrum at Target. That doesn't go in the crisis column. And biologically, you might feel, your blood pressure is rising and your heart is pounding and your cheeks are getting red. And it's just reminding yourself, this is just feelings. My kid's having feelings. And then if your kid's really, really falling apart for whatever the reason, you may have to leave Target. And again, that's not about, I can't believe you couldn't keep it together at Target, or if you keep acting like this, we're going to have to leave. It's just saying like, okay, we can't do this right now. This is too hard. I'll come back another time. And that's certainly something to have perhaps a lower bar for if you're like at a restaurant with other people trying to enjoy their meal. If you don't stop this right now, we have to leave this restaurant. No, it's just, we're going to go take a break. Quick, clear, firm.
Our own escalation always makes it worse. Yeah, please go ahead, Rebecca. Always makes it worse.
But one other thing in terms of, because again, this all ties together, but when we're talking limits, structures, and routines, before you go into Target, you're making a schedule for Target because your kids have never been to Target, or they've been to Target 3 times and they don't remember because they're so in the moment, right? So you're saying, we're going to go in, we're going to get a wagon. I'm going to put you in the top of the wagon. No, I'm going to walk. Okay, then you're going to hold my hand. We'll push it together. And we have to get these 3 things. And you're going to stay next to me, and we're not going to get you any toys. We're going to see such great toys. We're not going to get them. And I'm going to hold your hand because that's tricky. That's hard. Right? So you are pre-gaming. I call it pre-gaming. My son's teacher calls it front-loading. The same idea of structures, routines, predictability you're doing throughout the day before any big thing you're doing, to let them know what's coming down the pike, what's coming down the pike emotionally, and I will certainly have parents say to me, you know, but their bosses aren't going to do that. Like life
Hmm.
isn't like that. And it's all the research shows that your child will actually, as counterintuitive as it is, be better prepared to deal with the boss who doesn't do that if you as a parent do that than the opposite, right? If you as a parent can be a really clear, predictable, regulated person some of the time, your child becomes more resilient and better able to deal with life's hardships, as opposed to, well, then my child's never going to learn to deal with life's hardships.
Yeah, that does feel counterintuitive to a lot of people. But I think of it almost as like, it's like the learning structure, right? Like, I think the learning structure applies to so many things, which is like, I think of it as like the learning ladder or steps. And it's the sort of like first I do it for you, then
Right.
we do it together, then you do it and I'm there watching you, and then you do it alone, right? And everything is like that. Everything
Mm-hmm.
in life and everything we do with our kids. So when we're in that toddler phase, like everything is first I do it for you or with you, and there's so many things like that we want them to learn, that they have to learn by us doing it for them, or us doing it and us doing it with them for a long, long, long time. And that includes emotional regulation, predictability, all of these things that you're saying, which are so, so, so valuable, that we want in our kids. We have to do it for them.
Exactly. So that they can ultimately do it for themselves.
This is so helpful. It's always so like calming and helpful to talk to you. And I think it's like, I feel like, I felt like when my kid was a toddler, I was in a panic, and I wanted just a piece of that calm unflappability that someone like Dr. Hershberg can provide. So I hope
Oh,
that she has provided that for you also, dear listener, today. Her book is The Tantrum Survival Guide. It can be found anywhere books are sold, and you can't steal it from my neighbor yet. They're going to need it probably in a year. Is there anything we missed that you want to leave the listener?
I mean, there's so many things we didn't get to, but that always, so no. I mean, I could be like, yes, we didn't talk about strategic attention, and we didn't talk about playfulness, and we didn't talk about using humor, and we didn't, we can do another one, or people can get the book, or, but I think we dove into some really important pieces.
Yeah, yeah, I really appreciate it. And I'm just going to remind the listener, like, and for myself, the limits are like a fence, they're container, and we can use these physical limits and love and limits. So the love piece is like, I see you, I hear you, I'm empathetic, I'm with you, I'm, and then the limits, doing them in tandem together, right? So, and I appreciate the help for what to do in a public place as well.
Yes.
Pre-game
Yes.
people. Yes,
And just
yes, yes.
leaving the listener with, and I think this is all over your podcast, but therefore it still deserves mentioning, like,
Mm-hmm.
be gentle with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when I said, like, yeah, you can cook with your kid, like, I'm going to put my kid on the iPad. It's like, we're one day at a time. None of us are perfect. We're all the experts in our own kids. Take what you like and leave the rest. And if you're using any of the content on this podcast episode to beat yourself up about anything you've done before or will do tomorrow, then that's not the spirit in which it's meant.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, we all messed up. Dr. Rebecca Hershberg messed up. I messed up. And you know it. It's okay. It's
Messing up.
okay.
We're all messing up. I feel like it's a gerund.
Yes. So true. So true. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming back on the Mindful Parenting podcast. It's really such a pleasure again to talk to you, and thanks for everything you do.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.